Well, good morning and welcome to Nona Church. We're so thankful that you're with us, whether you're at one of our campuses today or watching online. Thank you for spending some time with your Nona Church family. Hey, let's put our hands together and welcome those that are joining us online today. So grateful that you're with us. Hey, I've got some good news for you. I want to start with a quick church update. If you were with us last December, you remember that we talked a little bit about our desire and our hope to be able to purchase a transition home that we would utilize that's adjacent to our Narcoossee campus to be able to help kids that are aging out of the foster care system as one of the many ways that we want to make a difference here in our community. Well, Nona, I have got some good news. I've got the keys. You just purchased 5 acres and a new home right here in our community. Let's celebrate what God's doing in the life of our church. We're so excited about what the future means for us. Well, last week, my friend, Pastor Jonathan Moynihan, spoke to the single folks in our community on how to pick a partner in our series, Modern Romance. And today, I want to talk to those of you who already have one. I'd say if last week was how to pick a partner well, this week is how to deal with the one you got. And so with that in mind, let's go to our anchor text. It's found in Matthew chapter 7. These are Jesus' words, and this is what he says. He says, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock." Jesus goes on to say, "But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand." Jesus uses the same illustration. He says, the rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. In this text, Jesus is pulling on the Jewish tradition that tended to juxtapose foolish behavior with those who are wise. The image here is that both homes in this illustration are the same, but the only difference is the foundation that the builders choose to build their home on. And you need to know this. All of us, every single one of us, we are builders. You are building a legacy. You are building a home. You are building a life. And the question is not, are you building? The question is, are you building on something that will last, that will stand the test of time? And the principle we see here in the text is that Jesus is inviting us to consider what it looks like to build our life on a foundation that can withstand the difficulty of everyday life. And it's been leading me to ask this question about marriage in particular. Here's the question. Why is it that 2 different marriages facing the same challenges end up in 2 different places? Like, why is it that one couple faces a cancer diagnosis, gets through it, and sticks together, and the other couple doesn't? Or why is it that one couple facing the challenge of infertility deepens their marriage in the midst of that challenge, while others facing the same struggle fray at the edges? Or why is it that during COVID, one couple saw their relationship grow and their unity strengthen, while the other couple split? Or why is it that one couple can make it 30 years in love and the other couple calls it quits and gets back into the dating game in their 40s and 50s looking for love all over again? And let me tell you, something that sounds impossible and terrible and exhausting is trying to date in your 40s and your 50s. Well, a lot of it has to do with the foundation that their house or their life is built on. And listen, it takes 2 individuals with strong foundations to make marriage work. Both husband and wife need to be committed to building their lives on the same foundation of Hesed, what we talked about in week 1 of our series, God's self-giving love in order to withstand the storms that life will inevitably bring their way. Because if we build our marriages on the foundation of self-serving love, we are preparing for an inevitable crash. And listen, if you're dating or thinking about dating, this is why who you pick as a partner is so important. And I'd say this, we really don't know what kind of marriage we have until the storms hit. But how we, according to Jesus' words, put his words into practice daily will either fortify or erode the foundation of our relationship when the rain comes, when the wind blows. So, if you're married, this message today, it is for you. And if you're single and ready to mingle, pay attention, because my hope is that you'll get a clear window into the insights that will help you have a strong, committed relationship in the future. Here's the truth. Marriage, by definition, is a risky proposition because you are making vows to a person whose future you do not know, who will change in ways you did not expect them to, stay the same in places you thought that they'd become different, and face challenges that you weren't prepared for. And that's why it's so common for me to hear people come into our offices here at Nona. And while they're on the edge of divorce, hear things like, well, my spouse has changed, or they're not the same person that I married. And in many ways, you're right. So what do you do when you've made a commitment to marriage, but you're realizing that the person you married is different than who you expected, or they're the same person who you thought would be beyond that thing by now? Well, the answer all depends on the foundation that you build your marriage on. I mean, if your foundation is built on self-serving love, then you'll believe the message of modern romance. So the question is, what is the message of modern romance? I think it's best explained by looking back to recent history. You see, around the time of the sexual revolution in the 1960s and the 1970s, the idea of no-fault divorce became popularized in American culture. Prior to that time, divorce in our context was expensive. It took time, energy, and you needed to have evidence of some kind of wrongdoing by your spouse. For the most part, divorce had to be mutual, and there had to be a substantive reason for a married couple to break their marriage vows. But the introduction of no-fault divorce in the 60s and 70s allowed either individual in a marriage to file and leave their marriage due to a legal clause that we now call irreconcilable differences. Give me a head nod if you've heard that phrase before, irreconcilable differences. Now, the intention behind this rule was good. It was that this idea that we were trying to help people, especially women, get out of marriages where they felt trapped. However, it also introduced a view of marriage that has not been held up until that point. It gave people an opportunity to think this way. If getting out of marriage was easier, then the risk of getting into marriage was lower. And this led to more people saying yes to marriage with the internal narrative that said, well, if this one doesn't work, I'll just get a divorce and move on to the next one. And in many ways, marriage transitioned from a matter of covenant to one of contract. As long as you hold up your end of the bargain, I'll hold up mine. And in many ways, a marriage has become a transaction in our modern culture. To quote one comedian, when asked why people get married in the first place, his answer was simple: tax purposes. That's why. See, when we treat marriage like it's a transaction, like it's an Amazon purchase where we try it on, and if it fits, we keep it, and if it doesn't, we'll send it back, everyone loses. Men and women who feel the pain of divorce lose. Marriages where the option of divorce is even on the table create a performance-driven culture at home that cannot lead to true vulnerable intimacy, and kids miss out too. Children who walk through the story of parents who divorce experience incredible pain in their life. And I can't tell you how commonplace it is for me to hear young adults say that marriage seems like an unnecessary risk to take, especially when they think about the pain that their parents' divorce had on them. Now, I want to be clear. Many of us have been in or are in toxic marriage relationships where we've been lied to, manipulated, abandoned, abused, or our significant other has had an affair. And I want you to know I feel deeply for you. And this message is not to elicit by any means any kind of shame. You are the beloved of God, and the betrayal you experienced was wrong and sinful and broken. And you need to know that God provides healthy and holy exit ramps if you find yourself in a marriage that's been marked by abuse or abandonment or adultery. So hear me, you don't need to feel any shame or guilt if you're divorced, either by choice because you had to leave, or you find yourself divorced and looking back, you realize that maybe it's because your marriage was built on the modern message of self-serving love instead of self-giving love, which is the ancient way of Jesus. But I do want to address those of you who are married today or desire to be married again or married one day. And I want to encourage you to make some decisions now that will help firm up the foundation of your marriage, because at the end of the day, a core question we're all asking is this one: how do I build a marriage that lasts? Like, how do I become like that old couple who's barely shuffling along in their last years of life, still with their hands close together? How do we become the family that all of the grandkids and great-grandkids want to be a part of, because we've had years and years and years of faithful love? Well, the answer goes all the way back to week 1 of our series, where we talked about this word, the word hesed. So would you say it with me on the count of 3? 1, 2, 3, hesed. One more time, now say it with your chest, hesed. Hesed is God's self-giving, sacrificial love. And here's what you need to know. Hesed is the foundation for healthy relationships. So I'm making an assumption here. Assuming we want to have the kind of healthy, long-lasting relationships that God says are available to us, here's the big idea for you today. You can take care of it in your notes or in your Nona Church app, but make sure you write it down. Here it is. Long-lasting, romantic marriages are built on the foundation of God's self-giving love. So, how do we practically implement the principle of hesed in real time in the 21st century with the hustle and bustle of kids and multiple incomes and so many demands on our life? Well, I want to give you today 2 ways that can be game changers for your current or future marriage. So if you're taking notes, go ahead and write this down. The first one is this: put down the box. In fact, would you say that with me on the count of 3? 1, 2, 3. Put down the box. See, here's what we don't realize. Everyone in marriage brings their box with them. Did you know that you have a box? You brought this box with you when you started dating your significant other, and you moved that box into your home the moment that they said, I do. You brought that box into the kitchen where you have breakfast. You brought that box into the bedroom where you watch movies or do some other things. You have brought your box into the marriage, and your box is filled with stuff. Like, your box is filled with things like this: a feather duster that's asking the question, who should do the household chores? Who's responsible for what in the marriage? You have some ways that you think it should go that were either from your background growing up as a kid, what you saw your parents do, or it might even be what you saw in popular culture. But you've got some ways that you want that to happen in your box. Here's another thing you've got in your box. You've got a clock in your box. And this is about how you think time should be spent in the context of your marriage. Where should we spend time, and who should we spend time with? Do we go to my parents or your parents for the holidays? I know that your parents are crazy and need to see a therapist, and my parents are nice and they give us yummy food. So I think we should spend time with my parents. All of us have time in our box. Here's another thing that we have in our box. We've got a nice globe in our box. We have expectations around travel is going to be. We enter into marriage thinking we're going to travel the world. I've got a passport and I've got a set of dream vacations that I'm going to take with you. And then you marry somebody who says, I hate airplanes. Airplanes are scary, and why in the world would you fasten yourself to an aluminum or metal tube and cross vast places in the world? How about we get in a car and drive to Dollyland, because that's a place that I love. And that creates conflict because they've got the same globe that you have in their box. Then there's a question about this. Boxing gloves. How are we going to fight? What ends up happening is you marry somebody who loves to fight. Fighting is how we get connected. Fighting is how we stay close. And then you marry somebody who says fighting is bad. I don't like it at all, and I want to avoid this as much as possible. But there are rules that you brought into your marriage about how you think people should fight and how conflict should be handled. And then, of course, as we look at our list, we've also got this. Like some of you brought this into your marriage. It's your comfy nightgown. It makes you feel comfortable and secure. You love wearing stuff like this. And your husband, he didn't have this at all in his box. It didn't exist. And now there's conflict when it comes to that as well. Here's what I'm getting at. All of us bring our box into our marriage relationship. It's a set of expectations we have about what marriage is going to be like, how we're going to be connected to each other, what decisions we're going to make, how we're going to spend our money. And here's what happens when we get married. We hand that box, these items and expectations, we hand that box to our spouse. And we set expectations for them on what we need and how we need them to come through for us. My pastor, Pastor John Hampton, notes that in most marriages, couples are fighting with one another to prioritize their expectations, their box, if you will, over that of their spouses. And they do it in one of three ways. First, in a marriage relationship, we try to convince. We try to get our spouse to see things our way. It sounds like things like, come on, babe, I read an article that proves my way is the right way. We send them DMs on social media showing them videos of couples that are doing it the way we think that it should be done. And we try to passively, aggressively convince them that we know what we're talking about. Or we say things like, hey, your box is broken because your family is broken. And if it didn't work for them, why do you think it would work for us? And if that doesn't work, then we move from convincing to convicting. We convict. We try to make the other person feel guilty for not meeting our expectations. We use passive, aggressive phrases and actions to let them know that they've messed up. We blow up in anger, or we use the silent treatment. I once heard someone say, I gave my husband the silent treatment for 2 weeks, and he thought everything was going great. Here's the third. We coerce. We use something in their box that matters to them as a bargaining chip. If she wants time with you, she better make sure that she's done X before she sits down. If he desires sexual intimacy, he can get it once the laundry's been folded. And we end up using precious things like affection as a reward for good behavior. And we create a culture in our marriage where people only feel connected if they perform. And in the end, marriage erodes into one of two situations. The first is we conform. We become someone we're not because our spouse will not love or accept who we are. And what ends up happening is that one person in the relationship feels like things are going great, while the other one suffers in silence. And the end result is one person in the relationship feels like they have to let go of who they are. And the message becomes, finish with me, you know it, happy wife, happy life. And as long as he doesn't lose his temper, then I'll do whatever he wants. It's not what I wanted, it's not who I am, but I will live life in their box if it means I don't have to deal with his anger or her nagging. And that's when leaving looks like the better option. That's when the word divorce begins to creep into our mind. And the other option is we compromise. And in culture today, we almost see compromise as a win. We look at one another and treat the things that are in our box like trading lunch in elementary school. It's like, I'll trade you my Slim Jim for your 2 fruit snacks. We try to find workable solutions to manage our expectations, our hopes, and desires. And in the end, marriage becomes one big contract negotiation. We set the terms, and then we watch each other closely. We end up keeping score. We monitor progress. And listen, many people have stayed married this way, but they cannot experience deep intimacy and connection living this way. And here's why. Marriage wasn't designed to be a business deal where you negotiate holidays and who does the dishes. It was meant to be a fully committed relationship that serves as a conduit of Jesus' love to another person for a lifetime. You see, when I'm constantly keeping score, wondering if you are holding up your end of the bargain, marriage is no longer about self-giving love. It's about making sure I'm not being taken advantage of. So instead of handling your spouse a box of expectations, here's what we know, that unmet expectations lead to eventual resentments. And instead of handing your spouse this box of expectations, here's a better option that connects us and leads to deeper relationship. It involves putting down your box. It involves saying, I might have some ways I'd like this to go. I might have some expectations that I brought into this marriage from my background, my personality, or what I experienced. But those expectations will not be the driving force of what makes this marriage. Because when we allow expectations to drive us, like a small crack in a window from a rock hitting your windshield on the highway, eventually, resentment in one area because someone's not meeting your expectation spreads across the windshield of the relationship. And it's only a matter of time before everything looks broken. Here's what I would say. Marriages where a couple needs their expectations met by their spouse are usually weakened by the pressure that's inside the relationship. And they end up falling apart when an external storm pushes against that relationship. So here's the deal. I'm asking you to put down your box and do something instead. I want to challenge you to write this down. I want to challenge you to win the serve. Let me say that one more time. I'm challenging you to win the serve. So I've just gotten into pickleball with Stacy. Anybody love pickleball? Anybody interested in this game? It's a ton of fun. Pickleball is a really interesting game, though, because many of the natural things you do in tennis are the opposite. But one thing that is in common is the importance of the serve. The serve is the first contact you make on the ball that starts the game. And if you serve the ball well, you have a greater opportunity to position yourself to score a point. And I want to take that concept of the importance of winning the serve, and I want to apply it to our marriages. Here's what I mean. The library of Scripture is clear that Jesus values and expects his followers to be people who serve one another. In fact, Jesus constantly connects the concept of greatness to service. In Matthew 20, there's a story where Jesus is approached by the mother of two of his disciples, and she asks him to make them number 2 and number 3 in the kingdom. And in Matthew chapter 20, verse 25 to 28, this is how Jesus responds. He says this, Jesus called them, that's his disciples, together and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Now look at what Jesus says. He says, not so with you. Say that with me on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to be, there's our word, great. Great. Do you want a great marriage? Whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant. He continues in verse 28 and says this, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. 3 chapters later, Jesus hammers this concept home, talking about greatness when he says this in Matthew chapter 23, verse 11. He says, the greatest among you will be your servant. Now, Jesus' emphasis on serving one another was carried on by his first followers. Paul tells us in Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 through 8 this. He says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interest of the other. He goes on and he says this, in your relationships, pay attention to that word, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Paul continues and says, rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of, and here's our word, a servant, being made in human likeness. But Jesus doesn't stop there. Paul reminds us, being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. You see, the way that we are reminded of what it looks like to be connected to the heart of Jesus is to know that greatness looks like service, that great marriages are marked by service. Paul puts it this way in Romans chapter 12, verse 10, in incredibly practical terms. He says this, outdo one another in showing honor. Quite literally, win the serve. Like if you were to see your relationship as a competition in any way, the competition should be, how can I outserve my spouse? How can I outdo my spouse in showing honor? It's not about what can I get from the relationship. It's how much can I give to it. So the question is, while this is generally true in relationships, we've seen this in Philippians chapter 2, we've seen it in Romans 12, we've seen it in Jesus' teaching, does it carry over to marriage? And the answer is wholeheartedly and unequivocally yes. In Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21, Paul starts his instructions to Christian households by saying this: submit yourself, which means serve, submit yourselves one to another out of reverence for Christ. In other words, in light of who Jesus is and what Jesus has done in your life, how Jesus has served you, how Jesus put down his box to do what was best for you, that's how you should serve the one that you call your beloved. Now, I don't have time to get into the following verses in Ephesians chapter 5 about the brilliance that Paul writes about how we are to relate to one another in marriage today, but I do want us to see something that is important in this passage. Paul is saying, in light of your love for Jesus, your goal in marriage is to submit, laying down your preferences for hesed, self-giving love, not because your spouse deserves it or has earned it or merits it, but because of how much Jesus has loved you. Tim and Kathy Keller captured the essence of Ephesians 5 in their book, The Meaning of Marriage, in an expert way. This is what they say. In Ephesians 5, Paul shows us that even on earth, Jesus did not use his power to oppress us, but sacrificed everything to bring us into union with him. They go on to write, and this takes us beyond the philosophical to the personal and the practical. If God had the gospel of Jesus' salvation in mind when he established marriage, then marriage only works. It only works to the degree that it approximates the pattern of God's, what's the phrase here? Self-giving love in Christ. You see, a great marriage is built on one core principle. I am going to serve you the way Jesus would. I am going to serve you the way Jesus would. So here's what that looks like. It looks like waking up every morning thinking about the other person's needs and desires more than your own. Husbands, it looks like laying down your hobbies so you can help with the kids. Wives, it looks like valuing your husband's hobbies because you see how it allows him to decompress. It looks like seeing sexual intimacy not as an obligation, but as an opportunity to serve the other in a relationship marked by trust and openness. It looks like bearing burdens, actively listening, and fully engaging. It looks like doing dishes even when it's not your night to do them, folding laundry when it isn't yours to fold. Because when two people take on Paul's posture in Romans 12 of outdoing one another in honor and service, a flywheel effect happens where we feel love and affection and security and want to give that back to our spouse. Which is why, if you are single and ready to mingle, do not link your life with someone who is not connected to Jesus. If they are not in love with him, they cannot love you. If she isn't willing to read the Bible, she isn't going to be able to read your heart. If he isn't willing to serve others now when he's single, he won't serve you when he's not. And if you're married, know this. The person that you're married to is too flawed and fractured for you to find inspiration to serve them like Jesus would if the source of your affection is them. And if our emotional needs are usually inverse of one another, then we shouldn't be surprised that we will need help learning how to love our spouse well, because oftentimes the things that help them feel loved are not the things that help us feel loved. And the foundation of how we love our spouse It can't be our own imagination or expectations or whether we think they deserve it. It must be grounded in a foundation of love that is stronger than our feelings of love, because our feelings come and go. But there is a source and example that never changes. We must allow that to be the foundation and the bedrock of our relationships. The example of the way we love our significant other has to be Jesus himself. And listen, a great marriage looks like a husband and wife focused on Jesus' love for them as a foundation of how they'll love each other. So listen, next week we'll talk more about how to make Hesed love, God's self-giving love, the foundation of our relationships in a really special way. But between now and then, let's stand together right now at all of our locations. And as we do, I want to challenge you with one of these 3 next steps. I want to invite you to pick the one you sense that God has for you. And I want you to open your hand where you are as your sign of receiving his call to action in your life. For some of us, here's the next step for us today. It's time to put down your box. Like, what are you trying to convince or convict or coerce your spouse or significant other into? There are expectations you have handed them, how much money they should make, what their body should be like, how they should handle life decisions that they aren't meeting right now. And it's become a burden for them, and it's creating resentment for you. And it is time to put down the box and to trust that Jesus knows what is best. For others, it's time to win the serve. You have been waiting for them to go first. You've been waiting for them to ask for forgiveness, to hold up their end of the bargain, to carry their own weight in the relationship. And yet, here's what we know about Jesus. Jesus' love has never been conditional on our ability to earn it or deserve it. Jesus did not wait for us to go first. He initiated his love on our behalf, and he calls us to do the same. It's time to go first, to outdo your significant other in service. If both of you wait for the other one, you'll stay stuck. But if one of you moves, the potential for connection and intimacy all of a sudden becomes possible. And lastly, for some of you, it's not about putting down your box, and it's not even about winning the serve. For some of you, it's about making this decision today. It's time to let Jesus love you. You've been listening to today's message, and you've heard about a God who loves you unconditionally, who placed your needs over his comfort, and you've never met that God. And I want you to know that Jesus is God, and he came to show us not just how to love, but why we were made as objects of his love. And God has made us to have a personal relationship with him. So I want to encourage you today, if that's you, to open your hand where you are as a sign to say, Jesus, I'm going to let you love me. And here's how you do it. In just a moment, we're going to pray together as a church. And when we get to that prayer moment, I want to encourage you to pray the words that everyone else in the church is praying with us from your heart. And the Bible says that if we believe in our heart and confess with our mouth, God is faithful to hear our prayer. I want to challenge you to share the decision that you have made, to trust Jesus with a friend. Allow us to give you a Bible at our New Here table, and allow us to walk with you as you know and take your next best step in following Jesus. So today, as we've stood, I want to challenge you with this question. For some of you, it's time to put down your box. Open your hand if that's you. For others of you, it is time to win the serve. It's time to stop waiting for them to go first and for you to go first. And for some of us in the room, it's time for us to let Jesus love us, because he does. And he's waiting for us to say yes to him.